Welcome everybody to the VVGBA and UVM Extension webinar series this winter and spring. I just want to first announce that this is being recorded, so if you prefer to not have your video in the recording, you can choose to turn it off at this time. Today we'll be talking about the economic value of wild pollinators to Vermont blueberry farms, research and grower perspectives with Dr. Taylor Ricketts and Rachel Gray of Owl's Head Blueberry Farm. And so we'll hear from our speakers, and we'll have time for questions and discussion. And if something comes up, please feel free to post it in the chat at any time, or wait, and you can ask questions or make comments aloud. And I think we'll keep folks muted during the talks, and I will pass it off to, we're going to start with Taylor and then move to Rachel. So I'll leave it to you, Taylor.
Thanks for me too for joining us here. It's always fun to talk about blueberries in Vermont, especially when it's not blueberry season. We were all just looking at this slide, wishing it were blueberry season. You can see that slide, right, Laura? Give me a little thumbs up. Yeah, okay, great. So yeah, for the next 10 or 12 minutes, I'm just going to summarize some of what we've been learning about the economic value of crop pollinators, wild pollinators to blueberries here in Vermont over the last 6 or 7 years of research. That's been done by a wonderful stream of grad students and undergrads at UVM. Blueberries aren't the only thing that benefit from pollinators. It's one of many, many crops that do. Just for sort of broader context here for a minute, about 2/3 or 70%-ish of the most important crops on Earth all benefit or produce better when they are allowed to be pollinated by animals such as bees. And that's easily in the hundreds of billions of dollars per year. So in the big picture, that's these kinds of crops, many of which are grown in Vermont, all of which are enjoyed here in Vermont. So it's a big, broad issue that we're all part of when we think about pollination and blueberries. And farmers don't need to be told this, but it's nice to sort of point out that when pollination is not very good, it's pretty obvious even in the grocery store. So all these are examples of the results of inadequate pollination from research studies. So misshapen fruits or wrinkly cucumbers, all of these are kind of symptoms of insufficient pollination. In the middle there is blueberries, and that's just showing that fewer berries are ripening at all when they are prevented from being visited by pollinators. Right, so again, it's a general thing, and it's an obvious thing that gets to the quality of fruits, the quantity of yields, sellability, and so forth. So pretty easy to spot. And just to kind of lay down the basics, that we think about kind of two groups of bees. One group has one species in it, and that's honeybees. These are the things you probably have on some of your farms and see in the landscape. An introduced species from Europe that's like wonderfully domesticatable and gives us honey and recruits really well to crops. The other group are the rest of the bees on Earth, of which there are 20,000 species. There's over 300 species just here in Vermont. And we found 80 of those species visiting Vermont blueberries themselves. So in addition to honeybees, there are this big, vast variety of native bees that cohabit our landscapes with us and can provide pollination services if we afford them the resources they need to stick around in our agricultural landscapes. This, by the way, is a picture of the world's biggest and world's smallest bee together. So we have been studying this kind of issue. Are we providing enough habitat for native pollinators in our own landscape here in Vermont? And here, just by luck, is Owl's Head Farm, which we'll hear from later. And this is Anna Boschman, the very first assistant that I hired to help start this project nearly 10 years ago now. And one of the very first farms we started working on is Owl's Head. So we're essentially asking three questions and have been trying to answer them, which I think and hope are relevant and interesting to you all. One is basically just who's pollinating blueberries here in Vermont? How valuable are they as pollinators? So how much do they contribute to farmer bottom line? And how can we manage them better? And I'm gonna skimp on the third one because I'm sure it'll come up in discussion, but I just wanna convey the first two about what we're finding about the economic value of pollinators to blueberry growers. So this essentially has been a multi-year field research program. This is a map of the counties around us here in Burlington with about 15 farms that we've located. You might be able to find yours on there, some conventional, some organic, all Vermont blueberry farms growing a range of varieties. And we essentially spent a bunch of years going in, observing and experimenting on them with really great collaboration and wonderful permission from the owners of these farms. So thank you, those of you who are listening. Up in the upper left, we watched bees coming to flowers. We caught some of them so we could identify them in the lab over here on the right. And we also did these pollination experiments, which I'll come back to in a minute, which allows us to estimate these economic values. So we spent a lot of fun summers on your land trying to understand blueberry pollination. And here's the beginnings of what we found. By the way, I should not skip over that. That's Charlie Nicholson, the grad student who really drove this forward in its early years. He's now a postdoctoral researcher in Sweden. Okay, so here's what we have begun to find. The first is that Vermont blueberries rely on native bees. Here's a simple breakdown of what we found on blueberry farms. And 2/3 almost of visits to blueberry flowers, that's bees actually coming to flowers, were from bumblebees. Another quarter were from other native bees, and only about 9% were these honeybees. So even though there's honeybees all around our landscape, they're just not coming to blueberry mostly. And again, that's over 84 different species of bees. So contrast that to one of the big blueberry growing regions, that's Michigan. And this is what the graph looks like in Michigan. They rely almost entirely on honeybees. And so Vermont's unique, and I think unique in a really cool way, in that we're getting this essential service to blueberries from our native community of species of bees. My Michigan colleagues wish that their graph would look like ours, so that it wasn't such an expense every year. Okay, some of the major players in those graphs, like I said, bumblebees, this is all in one species called bombus, and there's 9 of them that we found on Vermont blueberry. So a whole group of mining bees in the genus Andrena. We found 25 species of these in Vermont blueberry, and one of them is a very common one. And then sweat bees in the family Halictidae. It's a big, wide group. Many of them are green, beautiful kind of jeweled color. And we found more than 30 species on Vermont blueberry, just of those. So just to give you a sense of the variety of things showing up. Here's the next big thing we found, which is that farms vary a lot. So each row here is a different farm we visited. I took the names off for now. And the graph goes to the right according to how much abundance we found, how many individual bees we found throughout the summers on that farm. And then they're color coded by these sort of coarse groups that we could nickname and identify just by watching them fly. So to get better than this, you have to catch them and look at them closely, and we didn't want to disturb them. So they're kind of nicknamed. But this, I want you to take away 2 things from this graph. One is the overall abundance among farms varies hugely, from more than 700 to fewer than 100. And then the other one is that honeybees, apis, this darkest red, were really only found in any big abundance on 3 of the farms included here. So again, most of them had very, very few visits from honeybees, often despite having honeybee hives next door or visible from the fields. Okay, so lots of variation. That excites a scientist, because now we've got to say, like, okay, what explains that? What are some farms doing that others aren't? Because that could yield some lessons. And the two lessons that we've gotten are that management matters. Here's just one example of that the overall visitation rate of bees to blueberry flowers is much higher, 50% higher on organic farms than conventional ones. Not a huge surprise there with things like pesticides and other agrochemicals. And there are other attributes of farm management that we saw had an effect, which I can go back to. We also found that neighborhood matters. So for here, we drew a radius, a circle of 2 kilometer radius around each of your farms, and then asked how much natural area is in that circle. Here's an example on the upper right. And then we related that to, again, visitation rate, and found that if you have more nature in your neighborhood, 2 kilometer neighborhood, you get more visits as well. So not only what you're doing on your own farm, but also what your neighborhood is, which admittedly is less under your control, dictates or explains a lot of that variation in visitation among farms, why some have more bees than others. Okay, so we care not just about the bees, but whether blueberry responds to that additional visitation rate by bees. So for these, we did these experiments on just blue crop to keep it constant among farms, on just 9 farms. And we had 2 treatments, one where we let bees come and visit, as they do, and one where we added pollen ourselves, supplemented what the bees were doing with additional pollen to make the plant produce as well as it could, given the pollen it has, right? So we relieved any pollen deficit that it might be getting. And for this, you have to kind of pretend to be a bee. You collect pollen into a petri dish and then paint it with tiny brushes onto the female parts of the flower. This is what we spent a lot of time doing on these farms. And then we measured several things. Seed set, how many seeds are set, because that's a correlation with how well it's pollinated. Berry mass, which is of course really important for yields. And then fruit set, which is the number of flowers that become fruits. So fruit set's like how many fruits you get. Berry mass is how big those fruits are, and seed set's like a direct measure of how many seeds got fertilized by pollinators. Okay, so I won't go through all this. This is the last kind of graphy slide, but well, there's one more actually. But basically what we found is as visitation rate goes up, and remember visitation rate varies among farms a lot, but the farms that had higher visitation rate had better pollination, not as big a deficit in pollination. So these farms down here were yielding less than they could have because of the inadequate pollination they were getting with low visitation rate. These with enough visitation rate were yielding better. So I just like drew a crude line through here. We do it in a little fancier way in the research paper, but you can just see that as your visitation rate goes up, so does your yield, because you have less and less pollen deficit. That deficit's going away towards 0. So farms up here yielding all they could in terms of pollination, farms to the left yielding less than they could. And here's a student named Rose counting seeds under a microscope for hours and hours on end. Okay, so we can add this up to yield, and I won't go through all the steps to do this, but this again is kind of the take home. These are farms, and each farm, the white bar is its yield on the left side, kilograms per hectare, and the sort of theoretical revenue from that yield. So this is what the farms are doing in white and what they could additionally do in gray if they were fully pollinated. So some farms are nicely well pollinated. You don't get much more of a bump by supplementing, which is what we did with these paintbrushes. Others go up 20%. That's a big yield difference. Others 5 or 6%, and one farm more than 30. So there is a real economic value to be gained. It varies among farms, and it's typically based on how well you're pollinated already, which we can measure by watching bees. Okay, this is the part I was going to skimp on, and this is the last quick slide. What they need, I hope we talk about this, is really simple. They need places to live, so nesting sites. They need flowers for food year round, especially flowers that are open when blueberries are not, so that there's food when blueberries not in flower, and then protection from pesticides. So unlike a lot of environmental problems like climate change that seem totally intractable, this one is really tractable, and it makes it a much more hopeful thing to work on as a scientist like me. All right, so here are the take homes. Vermont blueberry is visited mostly by native bees, which I think is cool. Both on-farm and landscape factors affect visitation. Those visitors improve yields and can, if you don't have enough of them already, enough visitors already. And supporting bees is pretty straightforward. Those are the things I want to leave you with. And I'll wrap up with just thanking these people and these collaborators and all the farmers that have taught us about blueberries and let us work on their land, including this one, Mike Isham, talking to Charlie really early on. Okay, that's it for me. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Taylor. If anybody has any questions or comments for Taylor, now might be a good time. We could take a few minutes to discuss. I know I have a question about that slide where you were showing abundance of different bees on the different farms, and where it was showing that there might have been a higher amount of honeybees. Did that correlate to farms that were stocking fields with their honeybees, or not necessarily?
Yeah, it didn't necessarily. Oh, yeah, it didn't necessarily. In one case, it did. But in several really interesting cases, there were literally active hives stacked up right along the fence lines, and they just weren't coming to blueberry. They were going other places. I think you can see that the ones that have lots of honeybees, at least that third one, well, I'm looking at it, but you're not. Some of the ones that have lots of honeybees had very few of other things. And that's a common concern among bee conservationists, is that honeybees can sort of outcompete natives. I'm not sure that's really well known. It seems like it makes sense, but I don't think it's very well known. And it could be that those farmers, I can't quite remember, noticed a lack of other bees, and so they're the ones that stock.
I think we have a question from Becky.
Thanks, Taylor. That was super informative. I had two questions actually. One is just quickly, were you measuring marketable yield or like the seed set, like the berries with the best seed set?
We were measuring variables that relate to yield, right? So I think seed set's the least relevant one to yield. That's just got how many seeds are in there. And that's our way of like biologically, is it getting pollinated? But fruit set is just number of berries you get for a given number of flowers. And fruit mass is how big they are. And so for a crop that's sold either by volume or weight, those two things lead directly to changes in the yield that matters to farmers.
Cool, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that I just wasn't like, and also wondering, like, if you have a recommendation, I know a lot of growers buy in bumblebees that aren't native.
Mm-hmm.
Did you like experience any farms that were doing that, and if that made a difference, and also if there's any harm to native populations from that practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm unable to sort of say from what we did whether that made a difference. I'd say a few farmers were kind of experimenting with that. And they're pretty amazing. They just like arrive by FedEx and you open the little flap and they start. So those who had greenhouses and were starting really early, they often put them in their greenhouses, both because bees have trouble finding their way in and because it's really, really early compared to the flight season for bees when you're starting early in a greenhouse in spring. But we didn't find widespread use of those Bombus impatiens is the species that's typically trucked around. A bunch of people worry, and Samantha Alger has shown that they carry viruses with them. And so trucking them around and installing them all over the country from a common place that's infected will spread that faster. And it jumps from species to species too. So that's the thing I would worry about mostly.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hey, Taylor, thanks. That was great. My question is related to yields, and it's interesting in looking in that bar graph you showed how some farms have relatively low yields and they don't get a bump from additional visitation. And I'm taking it that that's due to some management attribute or environmental conditions, so the plants aren't growing well. But I wondered if anecdotally maybe you saw anything, was higher density plantings, with those low bars, was there some common themes that emerged? Yeah, they were widely spaced plants, or they weren't well pruned or
Yeah.
they weren't mulched or irrigated. Because part of it is you got to have the management to allow the flowers to form and have the potential to get the yield, to have the,
That's right.
so essentially they were doing all they could do, right? But they weren't actually able to do that much as far as putting out flowers, is the way I read
Yeah,
that.
exactly. Yep. I don't have like a quick take home of this was what explains the difference. It's several things. One of them is what you said, which I would call, like ecologists call that co-limitation, like something else is keeping yields down, inadequate, whatever it is, nutrients or something like that. So even if you're getting more pollination, the plant's bumping up against a second limitation that's preventing it from responding to this thing that you've relieved, which is a limitation from pollen. So that's really common in crops, as you all know. I also think some of the ones with the biggest gaps had the least pollinators, frankly. And so they were underperforming, they were limited by pollination. And I know the two big ones that are there, the two significant gray bar graphs, were some of the kind of most intensive management, most sort of chemical use, least sort of organic tendencies, even if not listed. So I could see why they were having fewer pollinators, and therefore when we augmented pollination, their crops could do better than they had been doing without us doing that. So those are the only two things I can kind of generalize. I think it's most likely those two things compared to things like water or pruning.
Thanks.
Good questions.
Okay, well, we'll have more time later to discuss. And for now, we can move on to Rachel Gray and her talk, which I'm going to help share here.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Taylor, for your talk there. And I'm going to kind of talk about our farm, Owlshead Blueberry Farm, and the impact and the importance of wild pollinators on our blueberry farm. So we're pretty much solely a blueberry farm. We don't grow any other fruits or vegetables, and are primarily a pick your own blueberry farm. We bought the farm in 2016, but the blueberry bushes were planted in the 1980s. So they're very well established, and the previous owners had run the farm that entire time until we bought it. They had never brought in outside pollinators and had always relied on the wild pollinator population around us, which was great. We felt like we had a strong pollinator population. We would be out there in the spring during bloom and see lots of bumblebees and other wild pollinators out there. And I will say we've kind of crossed it off of our list of something to worry about. The UVM was also finishing that pollination study around the time that we bought the farm, and we got positive feedback from them as well, that things kind of looked good overall for the bees on our farm. And I will say we kind of just casually observed the bees each spring, but I didn't have a really set system for observing them and consistently tracking how many were out there. We do have 5 acres of blueberries and then about 20 acres of open fields around the blueberry fields. And those fields grow up each year. We would mow them usually after frost if possible. And several streams run through our properties, and those will grow up with lots of brush and tall plants like Josie pieweed and other flowering things that we often see the bees down hanging out, enjoying those blooms as well. We have 20 crabapple trees nearby, and then we also started growing sunflowers. So that kind of just gives an idea of the surrounding areas. And then it's all woods behind our fields as well. So this past spring, bloom started pretty much at an average time for us. It was, I don't think it was too much earlier or too much later on our farm, maybe by a few days. And once bloom started, I was out there and thinking that I was not seeing as many bumblebees. Usually when I would be pruning, you would just hear like a steady drone of bees pollinating. And at first I wondered if it was just because it was really hot and humid, or maybe it was windy when I was out there. The buds had just opened. Like I think I started to kind of give excuses and wondered what was going on and where they might be. But over, I guess, a course of about the first week of bloom, I started to get more and more worried. And there were some emails going around on the VVBGA listserv from other farms wondering where the bees were. And so I also realized, like, maybe this is something that I really need to look into, and we need to be sure that these blossoms are pollinated. So I contacted Vern, and he was helpful in kind of talking through the pros and cons of bringing in bumblebees and what that process might look like. He also shared that ideally the blossoms are pollinated in the first 3 to 4 days, but up to 6 days after the flowers open. And this was about a week into bloom. So I did decide that it made sense to order hives if I could get them. So the first step was finding bumblebee hives. I had never gone through this process before. So called several different companies. A lot of them wouldn't be able to get the hives to us for another week. And our bloom is usually about 3 weeks long. So I was thinking, if I couldn't get the hives for another week, that would be 2 weeks into a 3-week bloom and would not be worth it to our farm. So kept researching and ended up finding some through Crop King, which is where I ordered through. And they were able to send them in the next 24 hours, like pretty much overnight shipping through UPS, delivered the bees in 2 quad colonies. So it's about 4 bee colonies per quad. And I had to figure out how many hives to get for our acreage. So like I said, we have about 5 acres, and they recommended 1 quad for every 1.3 acres. I decided just financially, and because we hadn't done this before, and also since I was seeing some bees out there, we do have natural pollinators, I decided to go with the lower estimate of what they recommended. So we ended up getting 2 quads instead of 4. And things went smoothly when they arrived via UPS. And then I figured out a location in the fields. We kind of have 2 different areas. So I set one in each area in a central spot in the blueberry rows where it wouldn't be disturbed by the mower, preferably in the shade and up on a pallet. And it's kind of like this cool cardboard hive. And you lift these flaps and the bees eat through this thin cardboard flap and come out. So it takes them about 24 hours to get through. I kept going out every couple hours and checking on their progress to see how close they were. And eventually they came out, and I would see them out in the fields. They're kind of daintier bumblebees. They're not like the really big bumblebees. It's a smaller size variety. And we had about 2 more weeks left in our bloom, and then our bloom ended, and the bumblebees will pollinate for up to 8 weeks and then will die off. The salesperson said that the queen bee might boost natural pollination population for the following spring. I'm not sure. That's kind of a question I have, is how much validity there was to that statement that she made. And a big question for us when we were deciding whether or not to order hives was that I was wondering if they could potentially bring in disease, and would this in the long term have a negative impact on the wild pollinator population or not. But anyway, ultimately ended up deciding to bring in the quads. So we used ours for 2 weeks, and then you can kind of close this flap and move the beehives to a different location. So we moved ours to Pearson's farm, and then they used the bees to pollinate squash or something like that, I think. So I continued to observe things. I definitely noticed an increase in the variety and the number of pollinators, like the second half of our bloom. So I think the wild pollinators seemed to catch up a little bit. I don't know if it just took a while for them to get going this spring or what happened. And then of course we had brought in those bumblebees. We ended up with great fruit set, good sized berries. I didn't look at seed set, so that wasn't something that I took into account. but it seems like all the bees that we brought in and around us did a great job in the end. And I'm unsure if the wild pollinators would have done just fine, or if the bumblebee hives that we brought in ended up pollinating most of them or not. It's hard for me to say. Some time and labor considerations. It took time for me to find and order the quads, especially because I had never done that. And just, it took a while for me to research what it would look like to have the bumblebee hives. I didn't know that it would even come in like this cardboard hive, and then figuring out where to place them in the fields. We didn't really have to dispose of the hives since we moved them to a different farm. And I know the last slide I didn't mention, I can go back, but they were $350 a quad, and then it was $200 for the overnight shipping. So it wasn't a small cost. It was about 1.5% of our income from the blueberries, not including the labor and time that I put into it. So moving forward, I would say it wasn't an insignificant cost for us, and we're planning to monitor much more closely with a consistent tracking system to see how our pollinator populations are doing year to year. And then I plan to have the ordering information and quad info at the ready so that I can do it really quickly again if we determine that we need to order hives. I think we're hopeful that this past season was a bit of a blip and not something that's indicating that our wild population is dropping, and will continue to drop or will continue to be low. It does sound like there was some different theories about what happened this last year, and that maybe the timing for queen bees readying their hives was off with bloom time. And I should add, when we bought the farm, we did not drastically change any management practices from before. I would say the biggest thing that we've done is prune the blueberries. They were in significant need of pruning. And now we're working on applying mulch, which was another big thing that the bushes needed. But our pesticide application is a similar practice to before. If anything, the amount in use is less than it was before. So there wasn't any big identifying reason for us of why our wild pollinator population seemed to drop this past year. So the other thing we just continue to think about is how we can improve and maintain our wild pollinator habitat, because it wasn't a small thing to bring in those hives. So being aware of our pest management, mowing practices, and then increasing the pollinator habitat. We're currently transitioning our fields from mowing to sheep pasture. So trying to rotate the fields so that other areas of our fields can grow up and continue to have flowering bushes and grasses, broadcast seeding clover throughout our fields, and intentionally planting flowers and habitat strips. And then we're enrolling 4 of our acres in the CREP program, which is a grant program along our stream banks, but that acreage will never be mowed or touched. So that will kind of conserve that area. And the CREP program will also help with funding, because they will plant shrubs and bushes for us with the federal funds. And we're trying to identify times when there are less plants blooming around the blueberries, and then increase the different plants and shrubs that we have that are flowering for the bees to forage on during those times. And this is a helpful graph just to look at the different bloom times for different plants. So the other thing I think I mentioned about going forward from here is to be much more consistent in my observations and take better notes about the pollinators. So I think what that will look like for me is observing certain bushes for a set amount of time, 3 bushes for 10 minutes in different areas of the farm during bloom, noting weather conditions, the number of pollinators and different types, so that we can just really consistently track it year to year much better than we had been. And I will say for us, we seem to be one of those farms that has a lot of bumblebees, and they're the most noticeable, but also recognizing that there are a lot of other small wild pollinators that are in and among our bushes during bloom time and helping with pollination. Doing our research, trying to be better prepared for this next year so that we're not scrambling. And I hope everybody has a good season. So let me know if you have any questions. And then this, just a couple slides of different resources.
Great, thank
That was
you.
Great, Rachel. Thank you. Quick question I have is when you say be prepared to order bumblebees if you need them, what are you thinking of as the thing that would throw the switch for you?
I think mostly just the I want to have everything ready to go to order. So have talked to the company, like a lot of the companies only ship their bees on Wednesdays, for example, and you have to order like the previous Friday. So that kind of already would give me a deadline of like, okay, if bloom starts early in the week, I need to know by Friday and make my decision by then if I'm going to go with this certain company. So having that information just logistically at the ready, and then being out in the fields a lot at the start of bloom and consistently tracking, like I said, so that I can see like how things look. So I don't know. I mean, we'll see how this year goes, and maybe we'll get a few years into or a few days into bloom and say, let's just order hives to be safe. But I'm kind of feeling like I want to trust the wild pollinators a little bit. Since it did feel like a panic last year. And like I said, I don't know that we needed to in the end, but I'm glad we did. And it kind of gave us the peace of mind that we felt like we needed. So I guess it'll depend on, weather and what I'm seeing in the fields during those first like 5 to 6 days.
Do you have crab apple trees on your land? I recall, I think. Do you ever go out and look at those? Don't they bloom a little bit earlier to maybe get a sense of what's going on? Or
Yeah. They don't bloom too much earlier. I would say it's pretty close. Maybe, and that's something that I think I kind of casually observe as well. So I don't necessarily write down when the crab apples start to bloom, but I want to track something like that more closely just to see how it relates to the blueberry bushes. It does seem to be right around the same time. And I will say, like, it did seem like we have wild apple trees too, and they were loaded with blooms their blossoms this year. That was one thing, just all of the fruit trees seemed to be loaded. And there didn't seem to be as many bees on those as well. So it seemed like across our acreage, there just wasn't as many bees out and about.
Can I just chime in here for a second? It's Taylor. This is fascinating to hear the story, Rachel. Thank you. I guess one relevant thing is that when we're out watching blueberry flowers and seeing who comes, the first bees we see are bumblebee queens. And it's a while before we see their workers. And so what that tells me is that blueberries are flowering just as queens are emerging and beginning to like establish a nest and provision it and lay eggs and start growing their young, which will help them forage later. And so, yeah, I think it could be one of the things you said, Rachel, about just timing. Blueberries are right at the beginning. If they were 3 weeks earlier, they'd be in trouble for pollination in this part of the world. So they're kind of right as the bees are arriving, kind of just in time. And then some of the solitary bees, the non-bumblebees, are even later. So I could see like slight variations in climate and weather setting that timing off by a few days. So that could be one thing. And that just makes you think about what climate change is going to do and if it's going to move the timing of blueberries differently than the timing of their pollinators. That could either make that better or worse. So that was one kind of just observation that kind of matches the story you just told. And then I had a question for Vern, maybe, who knows across lots of growers best. I have heard similar stories as yours, Rachel, that they were worried about few pollinators, and then it turns out they had a good fruit set. And not everybody was successful in getting bumblebees in quickly. So, Vern, have you heard about people who weren't able to augment and then had bad years? Is there evidence across farms that might tell us whether Rachel would have been fine anyway? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I wish I could answer with confidence because there's so many factors that go into yield, obviously. And I don't know enough about blueberry physiology and fruit set. The thing I'm wondering is about sort of compensatory growth of later set flowers, because I do know in strawberries, like with the vine, the clipper, there used to be a lot of concern about that insect until it was figured out, you can lose that kingberry and the secondary berries actually kind of make up for it. Your yield isn't reduced proportionally to what that first berry could have done. So an interesting study would be, and maybe even Rachel, you could do it kind of informally on a few bushes, cover the bushes for kind of early pollination, prevent them from being pollinated, and then take it off at some time and see if it makes a difference. And it may be that those very early flowers, if they aren't set, that the later ones end up giving you pretty much as good of a yield as you could have gotten, because some of those wouldn't have developed, because I'm assuming the plant sets more than it actually intends to mature.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to experiment with that and see.
I'm sorry, I've got to jump off, but thanks so much.
There's just a comment in the chat that says, I use bumblebees every season. And I believe when the quads are placed in the fields, they should be covered for shade and rain protection. We place a picnic table over the quads. I've seen shelters of different types over bumblebee quads on different farms, and like your pallet, Rachel. I've just seen another 2 pallets kind of tented over them as well. And I've seen other fancier contraptions in pictures too, but that's a good point. Protecting those colonies to keep them healthy is a good idea. I have a general question. Maybe Taylor, you might have some knowledge of this or maybe not. And I was recently looking at an extension publication out of the Midwest or upper Midwest about blueberries, and they were talking about carpenter bees as a potential issue in blueberry pollination because they can, I guess, create a slit in a blueberry bloom, which prevents other types of pollinators from entering at the natural opening and entering through the side. And I had not heard of that before, and I thought that was really interesting. And I don't know if that's something that you've ever observed in blueberry production in Vermont or the Northeast.
That's a great point. We saw that a lot. We have a little experimental patch of blueberries here on campus. And sometimes we pilot studies there, and then if they make sense, we'll ask farmers if we can do it on real scales. And we were just doing that last summer, and we found that a lot. Almost every single flower had a little bruised slit at the base. And that's a way that a bee whose tongue isn't long enough to get to the nectar through the opening of the flower can get to it just by drilling in right at the base where the nectar is, or if they're just, lazy or whatever. We saw that a lot. We didn't see any other bees ever using that same slit. So I don't think that's a thing. I just think the plant loses out on the actual visit by the carpenter bee that cut in instead of rummaging through the flower and getting the pollination done on the way. So, but I would love to do that. And it would be an easy study to do. You could just compare the fruit set of flowers that are robbed, we call it nectar robbing, or not, because it's really obvious to see which ones are. Last summer, we couldn't have done that because every single flower was robbed. We didn't have any not. I don't know if you found the same thing, Rachel, if you noticed these little brown cuts at the bottom of blooms.
I haven't ever noticed it, but I also haven't looked for it. So I'll have to pay attention to that.
Totally. I was going to say, we can share with you, Rachel, and anybody else, our sort of bee sampling protocol. It's a really standard one used around the country and around the world. So it'd be kind of nice, and it's not super complicated. It'd be kind of nice to do your observations in a way that is comparable to lots of other people doing the same thing. So if that's an interest to you, just get in touch. I can also send you a picture of what that little robbing hole looks like.
Okay. Yeah, that'd be great.
And I had a question for Rachel. I was wondering, your farm chose to buy in bumblebees, and I'm just wondering, was that a decision made through conversations instead of maybe choosing another commercial bee like honeybees? Or is it just because that's usually the type of bee that you see in your fields, or what drove that decision?
I think, and I might not be completely accurate on this, but bringing in honeybees sounded like a bigger commitment to me. And since we usually see a lot of bumblebees, and it seemed like a simpler thing to bring in a hive that I wouldn't need to maintain ongoing. I wasn't quite ready to commit at that last minute decision to raising honeybees. So it's not something that I would rule out in the future, but I know it would be a bit more of a labor time commitment to raise honeybees. So I think if we were to see, if we were to end up bringing in bees every year, then maybe I would look into raising honeybees. But for now, the bumblebee quad seemed to make the most sense.
I understand that you can also contract with other honeybee keepers, but honeybees aren't as efficient at pollinating blueberries anyway. So bumblebees are much better at doing that. So I was just curious, yeah, how that decision was made.
Yeah, I don't know. I would be interested in like borrowing a honeybee colony for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
On loan.
Okay, well.
I was just going to answer the thing in the chat, the mason bees. Those are really popular and common, I mean, on fruit trees, I know, apples and things. We just, for whatever reason, didn't see lots of them on blueberries. I'm not sure if you have, Rachel, but we expected to, and we had like a whole study about them, but we just didn't find very many. And I'm still a little confused about why. So, which is too bad because we kind of, okay, we have an apple orchard. Okay, so yeah, lots of experience and comments about mason bees for apple orchards for sure. They're really efficient apple pollinators and they fly right at the right time. And they're pretty easy to supplement just by giving them nesting boxes with holes the right size. They nest in little reeds and things in nature. And so if you just drill holes in wood of the right diameter, you can get them to begin nesting in your farms. And then it's the same thing about providing flowers for food. So they are sort of like bumblebees. They're kind of one step short of honeybees. You can kind of semi-domesticate them and augment their populations on your farm with things like artificial nests and stuff.
Taylor, when you were doing your study on different farms, did you guys look at how much the population varied year to year on each farm? Or
Yeah, we did.
And
yep,
how
we
much
did.
change, like how much would it change on an annual basis?
A really, really disconcerting amount. Like insects just wiggle a lot, and for all kinds of reasons. That's one of the reasons that we think having a diversity of bee pollinators is good, because if they're all wiggling kind of randomly, they'll even out. It's like a diversified portfolio type idea. But each individual species will have just good and bad years. And so seeing few of a single species in a year isn't necessarily like cause for alarm. Seeing a trend over time is, and all insect populations just bounce around a lot around that trend. Unfortunately, it makes it really hard to know whether they're trending anyway at all. That's a really good reason, by the way, Rachel, to just monitor bees in a constant way every year. It's really valuable, even if it's simple and on just a few bushes and in an incomplete way, if you can't identify them all exactly to species, which I can't. It's really helpful to just have long-term records.
Yeah, it's my goal.
It's good. It's great.
Well, if we don't have any more comments or questions, I just want to thank our speakers today and for everyone who came out and for anybody who will be watching the recording. Thank you for joining us. And we'll be having another pollinator themed webinar next Thursday at the same time, 12 to noon, and thinking about pollinators in cut flower production. So thanks everybody and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you.